Welcome to Make It a Great One with Dr. Dan. I'm Dan Peters, psychologist and executive coach. This show is all about bringing hope, connection, awareness, and wisdom through meaningful conversations that inspire us to become better versions of ourselves and make a positive impact on humanity. This is your space to pause, reflect, and reconnect with who you are, what you care about, and who you want to be. We have this moment, this day, and this life. Let's make it a great one. Today's show is our inaugural show. So excited for this show. This show is Risk, Adventure, and the Search for Meaning with our esteemed guest, John Graham. John shipped out on a freighter when he was 16, hitchhiked through the Algerian Revolution at 19, and was on the team that made the first ascent of Denali's North Wall at 20, a climb so dangerous it's never been repeated. He hitchhiked around the world at 22, working as a correspondent in every war he came across. A U.S. Forest Service officer for 15 years, he was in the middle of the 1969 revolution in Libya and the war in Vietnam. To the young John Graham, adventure was everything, and each brush with death only pushed him to up the ante and to bury ever deeper the emotional life needed to make him whole. Then it began to change. At the United Nations, he risked his career crossing his own government to support initiatives for peace and justice in Asia, Africa, and Cuba, including engineering a UN plan that helped end apartheid in South Africa. As a global peace builder, post-Foreign Service, he continued his peace efforts in Israel and Palestine. For the last 42 years, he's been a leader of the Giraffe Heroes Project, a global movement inspiring people to stick their necks out, to solve public problems, and giving them tools to succeed. He is the author of several books, including his most recent memoir, Quest, Risk, Adventure, and the Search for Meaning. His speeches, blogs, podcasts, and interviews have a global audience and are far, far-reaching. John, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here, Dan. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I want to thank you for reaching out to me. And as we're going to talk about in your life, there are a lot of what we might call synchronistic or serendipitous events that you have put together through patterns of meaning. And just as I was visioning this new show and had come up with my idea, literally the next day, I got a LinkedIn message from you introducing yourself and your work in your memoir and volunteering to be of service and support and helping me with my mission and my community. And it's just been the beginning of a very meaningful endeavor.
Thank you.
Your memoir, the process of this memoir. So you said at the outset, you came to see that the real story you had to tell was not about America's war, but the war within myself that surfaced in Vietnam. And I'm curious as to the process of writing the memoir. You're a journalist. You traveled all over the world. The detail by which you recount decades of exploration, of adventure, and service is astonishing to me. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your process of how you went about writing this memoir and when it actually shifted for you the double arching focus.
Yeah, it's great to be interviewed by a psychologist because you're asking all the right questions. Yeah, I did start with this book being a book about Vietnam. Then I realized that there are already a half a dozen other tell-all books on Vietnam. I thought the war was wrong. I thought the war was stupid. I thought we were losing, et cetera, but so did many other people. And my book would have just been another book of that genre. But as I got to really getting into the Vietnam War and the things that happened to me there, and especially some of the episodes toward the end of my tour, then where I really began to doubt who I was, what I was doing. I really realized that the story I had to tell was the story about me, basically. It wasn't in the sense of being egotistical, it's just that there was a huge story there
Hmm.
It was a psychological, spiritual story. You may laugh at this, but I think I got $1 million worth of psychotherapy in writing that book because it
Hmm.
forced me to go back to the beginning. I mean,
Hmm.
the beginning with my parents. A very strong-willed woman, my mother, basically a peasant from Croatia, immigrated to this country, and she was by far the toughest member of our family. My father, a very gentle man, a nice guy. I loved him, of course. But he was constantly being pushed around. And then it suddenly occurred to me that so much of my adventuring, some of the crazy stuff that you mentioned in passing and introducing me, so much of that crazy stuff was a back reaction against the fact that I was so badly bullied as a kid.
Hmm.
Um, and I just wanted to get back at the bullies. And my father was not the example of that. He just wasn't. He was a very gentle guy that got shoved aside by other men and never got promotions because he just got run over by more aggressive males. So I had to seek other models. And so, at 16, 17, 18 years old, the models I sought were all of physical violence. I went to sea when I was just 17 years old, as you know
Hmm.
from reading the book. And it was, I mean, here I'm coming from Tacoma, Washington, right?
Right.
And it's a nice little city. Nothing ever happens there. Nothing ever happened in my family. I ended up going to sea. It's a long story in the book as to how that happened, but I won't go into that right now. But I went to sea, and these were the days back in the 1950s when there were no container ships. And it was just a big ship with run by 50 or 60 really tough guys. I mean, really tough guys,
Hmm.
tattoos, the whole bit. And so they had great fun with me because they knew my background. I mean, I was this totally naive uh,
Hmm.
kid that got sand kicked in his face by bullies, and they were taking me on for the summer, and they were determined to teach me life lessons that they knew I would never forget and that I
Hmm.
would never get anyplace else. And they did. Oh boy,
Hmm.
did they ever!
Hmm.
And it was a whole revelation,
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
revelation not just to a wider world, that the world was a lot more than Tacoma, Washington. It was huge, it was wonderful, it was colorful, but a whole wider world of manhood. And
Hmm.
it was pretty shallow, but that's what I had. And the models for my manhood became these tough seamen who took me into bars and stuff and got me drunk, and all the other coming of age things you can imagine that I did in that summer. And
Hmm.
I loved it.
Hmm.
I loved it, and I really thought this is what men did. This
Right.
is what men did, and I finally. It wasn't my dad. I loved him, but boy, he was not the model I needed. If I wanted to get back to the bullies, I had to be like these rough, tough seamen.
Right.
And I came back from that trip totally changed. It really ripped everything. It ripped everything out of what I thought I was and what I could do. And
Hmm.
I'll stop there because I know you've got lots of questions, but that's
Oh,
how
I
it really
do.
started.
I do, and it's your memoir is a hero's journey, right? It is a hero's journey of going on a search for manhood, among other things, and what it means to be a man, and as we'll talk about, trying on in a uber sense of manhood, and times what nowadays might be seen as toxic masculinity and all of the characteristics of what seemingly define manhood. And I appreciated how you brought it back to your parents, and you talk about how your basically by disregarding your father as someone who was not that model for manhood, and of course as you talk about the bullying and the impact that bullying has, you were basically unknowingly disowning a part of yourself, um, by trying to claim this manhood. You were disowning this whole emotional spiritual side of yourself, which of course you got to, but only through serious adventure, several brushes with death, and a what seemingly and astonishing to me as a psychologist and coach who spends a lot of time with people helping them overcome their fears, whether you were climbing in Denali, traveling the world, hitchhiking in prison, there was this absence of fear. Like you literally somehow it went away into this. You were invincible. You literally felt invincible.
Yes, yes, I certainly did. And just to backtrack a little bit, I mean, I really had a very soft part to me, and I do have a very soft, compassionate part. I really do, and it just wasn't apparent. I mean, my and one of the core things in this was my mother, who not only wore the pants in the family, which didn't seem right to me. My dad should be wearing the pants, yet my mother was by far the toughest person in the family, as I said. As any good mother did, she made me a little doll when I was a baby and a toddler. But I loved that little doll. His name was Sammy,
Hmm.
and I loved Sammy to death. And when his yarn hair began to came off, I was about 3 or 4, and my mother sewed it back on, and I just loved him and loved him. And came a day, I was 6 or 7 years old, I think, and I still had Sammy, and my mother frowned because the clock she knew was a Croatian clock, and her brothers, my uncles, were all rough, tough guys, Croatian guys, and they didn't play with dolls when they were 6 or 7, and so I shouldn't either. So she took my doll away, and it was devastating,
Mm-hmm.
devastating to me. So I grabbed the doll back, and I repaired his hair myself. I learned to sew, and and then when she found that doll and took it away, then my pillow became my secret friend, and I would talk to my pillow, and I embroidered Sammy on the pillowcase. I mean, it
Mm.
was like I had a heart and didn't know what to do with it. And then came the golden bear, and what happened
Mm-hmm.
was, and this is my words for what I think you said in the psychologist's words, were that I hammered a sheet of plywood over that heart. I just hammered it over that heart, so I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't feel it anymore. And that left me free. That left me free to do all these tough guy things, all these John Wayne things, all the, what, as you're right, we would call toxic masculinity things. I was able to do them, and that I was fearless. I guess that's part of my nature. I'm still very fearless. If you're in a tough spot, now you want me in your foxhole because I know
Mm-hmm.
what to do in an emergency, and I'm still really tough at age 82. I guess I've always been that way. But the key thing, and you also mentioned this, is that I kept surviving all these brushes with death, and there were many.
Mm-hmm.
By the time I was 40, I estimated that I'd face a violent death, and I mean close, closely faced a violent death a dozen times.
Yeah.
And I kept walking away from it all, whether mountain climbing or a bullet whistling by my ear. And so I came to the natural conclusion that I was immune. I wasn't going to die a violent death, which made me, quote, braver and braver. But it really
Right.
wasn't bravery. It really wasn't courage. I was just like, it was just like a reality that I
Mm-hmm.
was not going to be done in by by my violent life, which made me even seek more violent adventures. So it ratcheted me up until I was doing things that were so incredibly dangerous. I mean, people still shake their heads.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that was happening though, and I think you describe it with the ascent in Denali, formerly Mount McKinley, was you started to have this realization or this idea: I must be here for a reason. Like,
Mm,
which is different than I'm just going to be that adrenaline junkie that you found yourself
sure.
to be at some point as you kept ratcheting up, and culminating in the Vietnam War. There was this other there's this other track going through you, which is I have to be here for a reason. There must be some reason I keep living in these things that I should not be living through.
Yeah, only it didn't come that fast or that clearly, Dan. It came by fits and starts. It came actually the year before when I was hitchhiking through the war in Algeria, and I had to jump from a moving truck because the driver was attacking me in the truck, and I jumped, and it turned out that I hit the only pile of soft sand in 30 miles and was unhurt. I
Hmm.
thought, why am I unhurt? Very interesting. And then the next year came Denali, and then there was like 3 or 4 really close calls. I mean, one of them in particular is described in great detail by David Roberts, mountaineering author, one of his books. I was in the middle of a rock fall. I mean, like a whole bunch of rocks falling 700 feet, some the size of basketballs, heading right for me. And I just stood there. There was no place to run. And these rocks all missed me. I mean, some of them were so close they all but parted my hair. And Roberts writes about it afterward as the damnedest thing he'd ever seen. And this guy has seen a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the key thing was, and I think this is what you're referring to, was I almost drowned in the McKinley River coming back from the climb.
Mm-hmm.
I lost my footing and I was tied to a guy on the other bank, and the river was in flood. So I was being thrown down the river. I couldn't swim. I was dragged down into the flood by my heavy pack, and I was pulling the other guy, Hank, also into the river. He was on the far bank, but as you can imagine the physics of it, I'm going down the river. I'm diagonally tied to Hank on the riverbank, and I'm pulling him into the river too. So it's just a question in the next few seconds which is going to happen first. Either I'm going to hit the river bank or Hank's going to hit the river. And if he does, then we're both dead because we're both going to drown. So obviously, I hit the riverbank and I'm sitting there gasping. The other guys come down, pull us both to safety. And that's when I had that comeuppance that you speak of, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
I sat there gasping on the riverbank, pretty clear, no bones were broken, but I was beaten up a lot. And again, it was Dave Roberts who was marveling about my luck. And this gets back to the question you posed. I mean, was it luck? Was it luck?
Mm-hmm.
All these things, all the crevasse falls, the rock falls, the
Mm-hmm.
hitchhiking in Algeria, all of this, was it all luck? It didn't seem so anymore. It didn't
Mm-hmm.
seem that there
Mm-hmm.
must be, there must, I must owe something for this, you know? There must be a
Mm-hmm.
quid pro quo. There's a catch to all this. But I didn't instantly figure that out at the time. It took me
Mm-hmm.
damn near 10 years, Dan, to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
That in fact there was a catch, that I was alive for a reason. All I knew then, and it left me more confused than ever, was that there was a catch. There had to be a catch, and I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know what it was. But I knew that I was alive for a reason. And
Mm-hmm.
even though I didn't know what that reason was, that was a huge, huge understanding that I gained gasping
Mm-hmm.
for breath on the riverbank in Alaska. And the story
Yeah.
goes from there as to how I finally figured it out. But
Oh yeah,
I'll only
we're gonna
tell you,
get there. We're gonna
yeah,
get there.
I
We
know,
got
I
yeah,
know,
we can't kill everyone too early.
I know,
Um,
I know that.
I the other thing that was happening there when you are climbing with your Harvard buddies is raised. Well, now I'm making the leap to Harvard. Raised um, Catholic, very, very, your mother, very devout. And that's what you were raised in. And that's how you grew up. And that's how you were taught to think. And then as you go to Harvard and you start to be pushed by different professors and different people of influence, and you start to question your beliefs, as many of us do when we leave our home and go on. And what's interesting to me and is how you then were reconciling this idea of God, of religion, and on the one hand, rejecting it completely, and on the other hand, being open to something that must exist that maybe you can't explain.
Yes, exactly. And I lost my faith in first 6 months at Harvard because all of a sudden Catholicism seemed rather silly, and you couldn't prove any of it. So to hell with it. But the thing was that as I got into more and more adventuring, I did develop a religion, but the religion was me. I was the religion. I
Mhm,
believed in myself and nothing else. But yet there clearly was some sense of acknowledging a higher power, or I wouldn't have had these thoughts on the McKinley River. What's
mhm,
the quid pro quo? Wait a minute. If I owe something, who do I owe it to? You know? So I think I acknowledged a higher. I always
mhm,
then and now today acknowledge a higher power. It's just that I was throwing aside any conventional religion as unnecessary, foolish, whatever. And then later on in my life, when I got into all kinds of mystical stuff, I discovered a lot more about that. But that's another story.
mhm,
But yeah, I came out of Harvard believing in a higher power, but the only religion I believed in was myself. I mean,
mhm,
I was it. I mean, what I
mhm,
did mattered. I was the religion. Nothing else mattered.
mhm. And it served you until it didn't. right? It
Yes.
served you, um, and sustained you, and this search for manhood became the search for and um the comfort in of power, right? It was about power. So you described being in many, um you were in service positions for a long time, but you weren't doing it for the same reasons you eventually switched into service.
No, I wasn't. I was doing it for me. I was in the foreign service with a capital S, but in point of fact, at that stage of my life, I'm now 20, early 20s. Uh, I'm doing it for the adventure. The only thing that mattered to me, the only thing that mattered was the adrenaline rush.
Mhm.
And so I came to an early realization, which kind of precedes the one you just talked about. And that early realization was that there did have to be a meaning to all this. There had to be a meaning to it because a life without meaning to me was like a watch with no hands. It didn't make any sense. So, yeah, there was a meaning to it. But I satisfied that question to myself by saying, yeah, there's a meaning to my life. The meaning to my life is adrenaline. The meaning to my life is more and more adventures. And since I'm invincible, that's not a bad meaning. I mean, I'll live for the rest of my life doing these crazy ass things. Um, so I started out there, but the meta realization was that there had to be a meaning to my or anybody else's life. It didn't make any sense to put us on the planet for no reason whatsoever.
Mhm.
And I'd found my meaning. My meaning was in one wild ass adventure after the other, and that didn't really wasn't really challenged until that last battle in Vietnam.
Mhm. And I'm gonna rewind us from there because I'm also remembering that when you were s- on your adventures, your early 20s, you fell in love, and perhaps your first love. I'm gathering, it seems so powerful,
Mm,
and because you had, I believe you said, the plywood over your heart and
ah,
the idea of
yeah,
manhood, it scared the crap out of you to the point that it you made decisions which put you on another trajectory of family and marriage, um, which got you your two wonderful children, but also was very complicated and painful.
yeah, yeah. You see how I glossed over that?
Yeah.
Good for you for bringing us back, because this is not a part I'm proud of at all. Yeah, you're right. I ended up in Australia, a graduate fellowship working in mines in Australia, but I didn't really care about geology at that point. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life in a lab. I was going to be out there with people as a war correspondent or something like that. So I was in Australia and I fell in love with this beautiful writer for the Adelaide Advertiser. Her name was Jean, and I fell just absolutely head over heels in love with her. Here's where we pick up on what you alluded to. Being in love was a direct challenge to everything I've just described about myself. I was a toxic masculine man. The only thing that mattered to me was the adrenaline rush. I was the uber tough guy. And all of a sudden, I was thinking these soft thoughts about the color of Jean's eyes and her soft voice and how much I loved her and when we were together how wonderful it was, etc. And I could feel that plywood board coming off my heart because it had to express these things. But I didn't care, at least for a few months. I didn't care. I gave myself over to that love. And then when my fellowship ended and I had to leave Australia, I I I realized that that board was no longer there, and I was absolutely terrified. I didn't mind being up on a high wire. I mean, my whole life up until then was up on a high wire without a net. I didn't care. I loved being up on a high wire without a net. But now, all of a sudden, here I was leaping and spinning, and I was no longer sure of my footing on that rope. And all of a sudden, my life had changed. And was I still the same tough guy because I loved Gene? And I got really confused about that. And but the confusion didn't last very long, Dan. It lasted maybe a couple of weeks as I was preparing to leave Australia, and the bad and the toxic masculinity won.
Mhm.
I just didn't dare stay in love because it undercut who I was. Who I
Mhm.
was the Uberman,
Mhm.
the tough guy, the guy you want in the foxhole. All of that. I just come back from from all these adventures, and so there I was, and I couldn't give that up. I just couldn't. And so what I gave up was Jean. And it was, I'm not saying it was a mistake. No, I've seen her since, and it was not a mistake. But, it was a huge change. And I lied to her about not sending her a ticket and getting married in Washington, D.C. It was one of the few times in my life when I was completely lacking in integrity. Yeah. So I
Mm.
came back to the United States and did some practical thing. The State Department had offered me a job in the Foreign Service, and it turned out to have been to a place called Liberia, a little country on the bulge of West Africa, a nothing burger country, where they sent all their retiring Foreign Service officers out to pasture. Well, I had to go there. I was about to go there for 2 years, and the idea of being there as a bachelor didn't seem very appealing. So on an off chance, I basically got contact with let's call her the girl next door. She was in fact the girl next
Mhm.
door, a young woman from the same town, Tacoma, um, and I went to. She was in summer school in Madison, and I went to see her just to see what would happen. And there was no love there. She was no Jean, but she would be a perfectly acceptable foreign service wife because she came from a rich family. She knew which fork to use at dinner. She was kind of funny and
Mhm.
effervescent, and be great at parties and stuff. Perfect foreign service wife. And so I said, okay, perfect foreign service wife. Yeah, okay, I'll marry her. And I did.
Mhm.
But it was a soulless marriage from the beginning, a soulless marriage from the beginning. But that was on purpose. I
Right.
could not have
Right.
married Jean. If I'd married Jean and stayed in love, it would have destroyed me.
Yeah.
But marrying, her name was Mimi. If I'd married Mimi, it didn't destroy me because she didn't love me any more than I loved her. She wanted to get the
Mhm.
hell out of Dodge, Tacoma. And being married to a foreign service officer was like exactly what her class wanted its daughters to do. It was a prestigious
Right.
position, foreign service wife, maybe someday ambassador's wife, whatever.
And your
And
parents were
so,
happy? I mean, everyone was
yeah,
happy
everybody was
except both of
happy.
you.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so it was a miserable marriage. We didn't. I mean, I don't know. At some point, I guess we hated each other. I don't know. We sure as hell didn't love each other.
Mhm.
There was I guess, a marriage of convenience was the kindest thing you could say about that marriage, um, and that's what I did. It was a terrible thing. It was completely lacking in integrity, and not only that, it was a perfect example of cowardice. I refused to stand up to making any changes in my life. And so
Mhm.
to preserve my tough guy image, I did something that put the boards back over my heart so I could do that. And that
Mhm.
meant closing off myself to my wife. I mean, she had her faults too, but boy, I didn't make life easy for her either. Yeah, so it was a miserable 15-year marriage. And it was largely my fault in asking her to marry me.
I would I have come to believe, just through my work with people and in my own life, while everything is not ideal and we make lots of mistakes, it all is part of the story, as of course you lay out in your memoir. And you were wanting connection. And yet at the same time, obviously, only a certain kind of connection that you were able to handle or tolerate at the time where you were with your own development. And yet, the pain, though, also propelled you to continue on your work and your journey as a Forest Service officer, but also discovering both your dark side, as it culminated in Vietnam, but also, as we know, that dark is also what happens right before the light comes in.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, but I didn't see that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Mimi and I go off to Africa, and she does exactly what she's supposed to be. She's the perfect Foreign Service wife. Everybody loves her, and we are the perfect couple. And we have the first child, Mallory, is born in Liberia. But I'm getting nervous because there's no adventure in Liberia. Like I say, it's a total backwater. Even in Africa, it was a backwater. Didn't stay that way. There was a revolution there 10 years later, but not when I was there. But then I got sent to Libya, which was an oil kingdom on the north coast of Africa. And not much was happening there, too. But for the first year after that, in September 1969, a guy named Muammar Gaddafi takes control of the country in a revolution. And all of a sudden, I'm in the middle of a real revolution, and I'm absolutely loving it. Oh, I'm loving it. And not only that, but my job got really important because I was the liaison between a huge, sprawling American air base just outside of Tripoli and the ambassador in Tripoli. And in the first few months, my job was like bailing drunken airmen out of the local jail. But when the revolution started, it was started by young officers, many of whom were in the Air Force, some of whom I knew. So I became absolutely crucial, not just to the embassy, but to the United States. Because don't forget, in 1969, there was no internet. And so cables and stuff sometimes took days to go back and forth. It was almost not quite like 1789 or something, but still, a lot of stuff happened that you had to think. You had to think by yourself. There was no orders coming from Washington. And so it was absolutely great. I was in a position of real power. And not only that, but the worse things got, the better I got. I loved, I mean, people were freaking out at the embassy when they saw the first burning automobile or the first mobs throwing rocks at the embassy. I loved it. I just loved it. Yes, I'm back in it. I'm back in it. I'm risking my life again. Yes. And so there it was. And so I was part of the whole Libyan revolution thing and the Americans creating plans on how to deal with it. Basically, if you know, we got our asses kicked in Libya, thrown out of the country. And my memoir makes it plain why that happened. I won't go into it now because it's mostly a political story of how screwed up the American policy was at the time. But I went from the fact to the fire. I went from there to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to Vietnam, the war in Vietnam forever, but for some reason the State Department never sent me there. But now they did, and I was thrilled. And I told the State Department to send me to the most dangerous spot they had, the hardest assignment they had, and they didn't disappoint. They sent me as the advisor to the city of Hue, which was a mid-sized city right up against what was then the border with North Vietnam. And it was your viewers may remember it from the Tet offensive, the Tet massacre. It happened at Hue 2 years before I got there. And so I was advisor to the mayor of Hue, but more to the point, I was the political officer. So I had a lot of tough guy things to do and intelligence and counterintelligence in addition to distributing a whole lot of American aid money to build schools and stuff. So there I am, and every day could have been my last. I was obviously 6.5 feet tall, a ready target for assassination. The Viet
Mm-hmm.
Cong could have taken me out anytime they wanted to. So I was there for a year and a half with every day thinking it could be my last. Every day I'd get out and check for bombs in the bottom of my Jeep. I mean, but again, I mean, for the most part of that, it was yes, I'm in a real shooting war. That's the reason I wanted to go to Vietnam. I
Mm-hmm.
sure as hell didn't want to go there as a patriot because I thought that war was stupid from the beginning, unwise, stupid. And when I got there, within days, I saw that it was absolutely unwinnable because the country was coming apart at the seams. There was no political glue, mostly because of the corruption of the leaders in Saigon.
Mm-hmm.
So the war was lost. I was only there for the adventure. And until the last month or so, that sufficed.
Mm-hmm.
Then came that battle. And I'll
Yeah.
stop there because I don't know how much
Yeah.
you want me to say about that.
Yeah. We'll just summarize the battle, and I will say, and you can correct me, but it's when it's about the time your close friend looked at you in the eyes and was like, kind of like, "Whoa, what's going on, man?" And you are at the height of um it's the height of the war, it's height of the conflict, it's desperate. You're trying to keep everything together in your role and in power. And um, it's when you also realize some of the decisions you were making and how you were thinking is like, whoa, what am I doing? What have I done? Right? It's like it's really where it kind of crescendoed into this questioning.
Yeah, no, it did, and I think in many ways, some of your viewers may regard me as absolutely nuts. For the only thing that mattered to me was the adrenaline rush, and the thing is, Dan, is that up until that point, I had all these wild ass adventures, but no human being had tried to kill me. That was the one adventure that I hadn't yet had.
Hmm.
That's why I wanted to go to a shooting war. I wanted people to try to kill me so I could kill them before they killed me. All right.
Hmm.
Does that
Hmm.
sound crazy?
Hmm.
Well, that's what I was.
Hmm.
And so I got that opportunity in Vietnam. I was in a shooting war, and then even though the war was senseless and stupid, and I knew it was lost, I finally got what I wanted. I was in the middle of a shooting war, and yes, in fact, bullets were whistling by my head, and yes, I fired back, and yes, it was dangerous as hell, 50 miles from the DMZ. Um, but I loved it until that final battle, and I'll just briefly tell the story. The Hue was almost overrun 3 years before the country finally fell. 1972, so-called Easter Offensive. The North Vietnamese attacked across the DMZ and surrounded Hue on basically two sides. The third side was the South China Sea. The fourth side was the only side left open, a road south to Da Nang. But the NVA were getting closer and closer, and the South Vietnamese army had crumbled because of poor leadership and corruption, and fallen back. And at one point, the North Vietnamese tanks and troops were only 6 or 7 miles from the city gates. But the key thing was my job then was to create martial law in the town, in the government. Most of the officials had fled, so it was up to the Americans, and there were only four of us. Mind you, now this is after the American troops had left under the withdrawal agreement. There was no 101st Airborne there, no Marines this time, not this time. So there were four of us left, and we had to do something to create martial law because the streets were jammed with terrified refugees, and they blocked the flow of ammunition going to the troops, such as they were, still trying to fight to the north of the city. So we had to do something, and the only thing I could think to do, without any particular knowledge that it would work, was to set up a firing squad. And that firing squad was to round up deserters who had burned the marketplace and were terrorizing and raping people. And so, but I took a look at it, and these deserters, these looters, were all farm boys, 16, 17 years old, who had been dragooned off their rice paddies maybe the week before. They weren't innocent, but on the other hand, they were farm boys. And I was wanting to line them up against poles and start shooting them so that I could um, create martial law in the city and the ammunition trucks could move again.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember doing that one night, and it was a horrible night. And I think the book captures it rather well. Artillery was thumping and booming and crying. Terrified people were heading south toward Da Nang as best they could, screaming and yelling, the crunching of broken glass. And I was looking at it was the first circle from hell. I think I described it in Dantean terms, and it was like unbelievable, chaotic, and violent.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I just set up a firing squad.
Mm.
I put my head down on a desk. And then I remember taking my 45 out of the holster and putting it on the desk because it hurt too much to sit next to that cold steel. And I just started to cry. And it finally all came together for me, the uselessness of the war, the fact that I was only there for the adrenaline rush. And now I'd possibly sent a half a dozen farm boys to their deaths just to make me feel good about the adrenaline rushes in my own heart.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like, how could I have let my life become that shallow? And that's why I wept.
Mm-hmm.
how could my life have become that shallow? And that was the lowest point in my life, Dan, the lowest point in my life. It took me a long time to climb out of that hole.
Mm-hmm.
I survived
Mm-hmm.
the night. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and fighter bombers from carriers offshore obliterated the North Vietnamese troops that were attacking the city. And obviously, I was saved, and a few months later, transferred back to California.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the lowest point, and
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
was it was the time when I finally realized that yes, there was a meaning to my life, but I was no longer so sure that that meaning was organized was violence. I was no longer so sure that it was the adrenaline rush.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was something else because the adrenaline rushes no longer were working for
Mm-hmm.
me. Technically speaking, I probably had what is now called PTSD, a severe case of PTSD.
Yeah.
And
Well.
I was sent back to California. The State Department recognized that, sent me
Mm-hmm.
to get a nothing burger degree at Stanford, just as a reward for
Mm-hmm.
not getting my head shot off, and maybe because they knew I needed a year off.
Well, and many things changed from that. I You just said PTSD, and my thumb is on my note right now that in capitals and bold it says PTSD in
Yeah.
this, and you had written you came back from Vietnam a stranger to yourself, uncertain and afraid for the future, violent nightmares, avoiding the light side and going to the dark side to avoid sniper fire, jumping at sudden noises, the sound of helicopters instantly took you back to Vietnam. And nobody, none of us who have not been in that situation can have any inkling of understanding what that is like and what it does to someone. And I will say, yes, you absolutely had PTSD, and I don't know how you could not.
Well, it took me 6 or 7 months to write that chapter because I kept breaking down in tears. I
Mhm,
couldn't hold it back. I
mhm.
couldn't
Yeah,
hold it back, and I was lucky because in those years in California, there were what were then called encounter groups,
yeah.
basically group sessions, and
The
oddly
Creative
enough,
Initiative Foundation, right? The
yeah, the
CIF.
Creative Initiative Foundation, and they were really good.
Mhm.
And they called me on my shit. They
They
called
pissed
me
you
on
off. They
that.
totally pissed you off.
They totally pissed me off. I mean, everybody else in the men's part of this group was, an accountant or a graduate student or whatever. None of them had faced any kind of dangers or risk or something. They were all pretty ordinary people, and yet I was there in that room as John Wayne Plus, and I
Mhm,
told all my war stories. And they would clap politely, but for some reason they weren't that impressed. And it became clear why they were not impressed because I was hiding everything else. They could see through. They could see through to my little doll Sammy, and I couldn't. They could
mhm,
see that in my weaker moments I was in fact a soft, compassionate person, and yet called on it, I would deny it, deny it, deny it,
mhm.
until finally there came one final afternoon, and all the men were off by ourselves with a very skilled facilitator, and we've been talking about the animus and the anima,
Yes,
the male side
Jungian.
and the female
Yes.
side that each one of us has. Okay, so
Mhm.
we've been told that a lot, and so finally, out of the blue, this facilitator asked this group of, like I said, what, 16, 18 men, I guess. He asked the group who had the strongest anima, female side, of all 18 of us. And I thought, oh, it's that weepy assistant lawyer. I mean, he's always breaking down. It's him. No, no. Without any chance of collusion, all 18 men said him, pointing to me. Him.
Mm,
I couldn't I couldn't talk. What are you
mhm.
talking Wait, what are you talking about? I've hitchhiked through a revolution. I've been in a war. I've dodged bullets. I've climbed huge, dangerous mountains, and I am the most feminine man in the room. And like I said, I got furious. I
Yeah.
walked out. I was screaming curses at these men, and just went running down these paths. And finally, I just sat down in the middle. There were some leaves falling. It was fall, and I started crying again because I realized these men were absolutely right.
Mhm,
And all I could think about was my doll Sammy,
mhm.
and all I could think about was Jean, the girl
Hmm.
in Australia. And all of a sudden, what I had done to close off that part of me became utterly apparent.
Hmm.
I wasn't who said I was. I was a
Hmm.
different person. I had been hiding it for then 29 years. I had been hiding it. And these men, thank God, had the courage to tell me to get off my shit and
Hmm.
uh, and own
Yeah.
up to it. And
Yeah.
it took a long time to crawl out
Hmm.
of that hole because the boards were really thick.
Hmm. And then two things were happening simultaneously for you. I mean, many things, but the two that I'm going to highlight. So then you're assigned in your work life to a small delegation, NATO's nuclear planning group, where you're on this top secret committee, trying to do what you call like these this ludicrous we're going to just do targeted nuclear bombing, right? And this is Cold War times. And then at the same time you come to learn about the inner peace movement, the IPM. And now you're learning meditation. You're learning to go inward. You start to have actually some mystical experiences. And on the one hand, you start to realize there's purpose. You're a healer. And on the other hand, you're planning nuclear war.
Yes, yes, yes. I told you this 10 years after the revelation in California, it took me 10 years to climb out of this self centered hole. And there were a lot of backslidings, a lot of backslidings. I was sent back to Washington where, because of my role in Vietnam, was given the plum job and promoted rapidly. And I ended up in the nuclear planning group. And it was the most prestigious job you could get as a foreign service officer. I mean, I would fly to Europe and be met with big black limousines and whisked off to secret places and castles in Norway and stuff. And I'd sit down with similar people from Norway and Germany, United States, Italy, wherever, and we would plan how to target nuclear war so that we could quote win the nuclear war, even though
Hmm.
any idiot could figure out that the minute two or three of these things went off, it was game over. The whole world would be incinerated. But we didn't care because it was so prestigious. You came back from the NPG and you were like a god in the Foreign Service, and so I was swept up in that. And it's like I say, it took me 10 years. It wasn't a state. I had a
Hmm.
lot of backslidings, 2 steps up, 1 step back. Well, the nuclear planning group was part of that.
Hmm.
And then at the same time, I was doing this other thing, and because my life then was like completely unhinged, right? I've had this revelation from Vietnam and from the encounter groups. I've I've dedicated my life to climbing out of that hole, but a bit of backsliding there with a nuclear planning group, and then yes, my wife. I was still married to the woman I married originally. Being Catholic and stuff, it was too damn hard to get a divorce and parents and all that. So
Hmm.
then she suggested we go to this IPM thing. It was a guy was giving a speech in the nearby Holiday Inn in Virginia, and so I figured, okay, what the hell? And so we got a sitter for the kids and went. And there's this guy, a Puerto Rican guy in a bowling shirt. He sure didn't look like a guru. Um, but he said basically something. I can encapsulate his whole thing in one or two sentences, and that is, none of us need any intermediary to talk to God, to the higher power. You can talk to God yourself. You don't need priests, rabbis, anything like that. You can talk to God yourself, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. And then he demonstrated with some people from his own group who went into trances, and in a trance state, they would come back and talk to the group as somebody they weren't, and start describing what the afterlife was about, or whatever, or do a healing, for example. And so, that evening ended, and Mimi and I went back home, sort of scratching our heads, saying, "Oh, come on, that's just bullshit. It was a theater act. Those were highly trained actors, and we got hauled in." But then she says, "Well, John, but They didn't ask for a dime. We didn't even leave a dime. I mean, they weren't asking for money. They didn't even have a sign-up list, for God's sake. I mean, it didn't sound like a cult. So, all right, all right, all right. So that evening, we go to sleep. I wake up in the middle of the night, and the house is on fire. So I think the room is full of smoke. I have bad nightmares. The room's full of smoke. I wake the whole family, and they look at me as if I'm nuts because there isn't any smoke. And clearly, the house is not on fire. So I go back to sleep, and the same thing happens the next night, only worse. Worse nightmares, more smoke, and again, no smoke, no fire. Happens the third time. So I think, wait a minute. This all happened after listening to Francisco, the Puerto Rican guru, and so there's got to be a connection there. So I called up one of the guru's lieutenants, a woman named Sarah, and she said, that's interesting because stuff like that happens sometimes after an initial session, but it only happens to people who are naturally psychic. I've seen it happen a couple times before. And I said, oh, don't be silly. I can't bend spoons with my mind. I went to 5 degrees from Harvard and Stanford, for God's sake. I'm as much of an intellectual as you can possibly get. I don't believe in any of this crap. And she laughs and says, well, that's what the other people said too. He says, why don't you come on over? I've got a group starting on meditation, and maybe you could profit from it. So I don't know what else to do. So I end up in Sarah's living room, and I try to meditate. Seems really stupid to me to shut off thoughts, but I did the best I could because I didn't know what else to do. And so it was an interesting experience, and I gradually learned to meditate and to go. And then at a certain point, after a month or so, um, Sarah says, "Okay, John, now this time when you meditate, I want you not to think of any breaks whatsoever, not to think of coming back from meditation. I'm not going to clap my hands or wake you up. See where it goes. See where it goes." So I go into a meditation, and I go into a very deep meditation. I'm sitting there in a chair in her living room, and all of a sudden I feel a rush, and I'm not in that chair, but I'm running toward the edge of a cliff, um, and I run off the edge of that cliff, and I'm falling, and just before I hit bottom, I'm not falling anymore, but I'm floating. And I float back into the room, and I float over my chair, watching my body in the chair. I float over Sarah. I float over Mimi, who's also there in the room, and it's like, what the hell is going on? So then I finally do hear a clap of hands, and Sarah sets me back because this is the first time this has happened, and she's a pro at this. Um, so I thought, wow, that was an unusual experience. So then I take a day or two off work, and I go to an occult bookstores in Georgetown, and I start reading about people like Saint Teresa of Avila or Saint John of the Cross or mystics from India, and I learned that people have had out of body experiences since the beginning of time. And people have had mystic experiences since the beginning of time. I'm hardly the first one. But isn't it interesting that what I experienced was so much close to what Saint Teresa of Avila was experiencing, and all these other mystics? I was experiencing the same thing. So maybe there was a connection there, and so now I was like really getting into it, and I would go back to Sarah's living room, and this time now with a lot less fear. And when my body was, when my soul, let's call it, my spirit would leave my body, it would take a journey, and I would walk through these white tunnels through the white light into an area that was just an area. It was filled with white light. There was nothing else there. There were other beings there, but they weren't beings. They were thoughts. They were spiritual entities, and they wished me well. And some of them seemed to be very wise and began talking to me about the way the universe really worked, about the central thesis being that we were all one, that I was part of a cosmic unity. So, I spent a lot of time out there, week after week, going back to this place of peace. Interesting thing was, at the same time, I was also reading books by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on the people that had died on the operating table and then come back. They had gone to the same place, the white light, the whole bit. I mean, it was like, oh, man, I'm not alone. So then I begin to think, all right, I'm having mystical experiences or I'm nuts. One or the
Mm-hmm.
other. One of those two things got to be true.
Mm-hmm.
I really am a mystic. I am learning about the universe in a mystical way. I'm getting all these metaphysical truths that I never got through any organized religion, or I'm nuts. I mean, this is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, to link the two things going on in my life, I would do this on the weekends, and then Monday I'd fly to Brussels and make plans to incinerate Leningrad for the next 3 days, and
Mm-hmm.
then come back. And by now, I was doing my own trance healings. I was actually working as a paid psychic in the Holiday Inn, and that same
Nice.
Holiday Inn. I
Nice.
mean, I was like I was conjuring up spirits and dead relatives and stuff. It all seemed to be very, very real, and the messages that were delivered seemed to be very, very real and very, very helpful to the people in the séance. Um, so there I was, running séances and planning nuclear war at the same time. So it was wild, also very confusing, and I didn't
Yes.
know what else to do. So I said, okay, all right, I'm not going to call you God, but the entity that I'm a part of, the all at one, whatever you want to call it, I want a sign. I mean, please, I'm a weak person, and I just can't accept all this. I got to have a sign. And I'll tell the story now. Then you
Well,
can.
yeah, you got. I'm going to set you up on this story. So,
Yeah.
among this was one of your near-death experiences that was actually also the later ones that was written about. A famous saving. So, basically you and your daughter, so you've left NATO, you've left the service, you realize you're a healer and you need to heal and you need to help the world solve problems, use all of your diplomacy skills, your political skills, your knowledge of all of these systems, and you're trying to scrape together a consulting job and you're speaking, and then you get this gig on a cruise liner.
Oh, hey, Dan,
The
can I interrupt you this
Yes,
time? Because now
yes.
you're jumping ahead of the one thing I wanted to say
Oh, okay, I jumped,
about
go.
how I determined I wasn't crazy, because
Oh,
that all
go
leads
ahead.
up
Go
to
ahead.
the
Go
story
ahead.
you're beginning to tell.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so I asked for this sign, and a week later, Mimi and I and the kids were down on a farm near Charlottesville, a very pleasant place in Virginia. And we went there often. And the farm was owned by one of my friend's parents and his wife. And so we're there, and we're all enjoying a drink on the farm porch. And the kids come running up, and
Oh,
in front of them
yes. Yes. Yes.
was
Yes.
a
Yes.
little kid screaming in pain, and all the other kids are screaming after him. And this little kid comes in, and he's just screaming in pain, and I can see why. The kid has put his hand on a red hot tractor tailpipe, and there are just awful burns in his hands, right? Or at least in his left hand for sure. The da- the owner of the farm goes rushing in to find a first aid kit, and this immense calm settles on me. Everyone else is freaking out, and I ask the mother to give the child to me. She looks at me, doesn't know what else to do. She gives me this 4 or 5, maybe 6-year-old boy, and I hold the child. And I put his horribly burned hand between my hands, and I put myself back into that place of light, okay, that I've been experiencing from Sarah's living room. And I hold his hand there for maybe 5 seconds, and I take my hands away, and there's not a sign of a burn, not
Hmm.
a sign of a burn.
Hmm.
So that's the sign. Everybody else on the farm said, "What the fuck?" I mean, really? Uh, but I know what's
Yeah.
happened. It's the
Yeah.
sign I look for, and I never look back after
Yeah.
that. And
Thank you.
that sets
Yes.
you up for what you were
Yes.
talking about.
Thank you for interrupting me and saying that. That was a huge sign. I was going to your next sign, right? I guess your
Yes,
next sign. So first of all, you said in the book, that was the first and only time you have physically healed
yes.
someone. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Um, So this next famous event, which is in the papers, you're on the cruise liner. You got a talking gig. You're getting paid to give talks on your areas of specialty. You bring your daughter along with you, and it's like your own version of the Titanic, basically. This beautiful cruise liner, which now catches on fire, and it is a very thrilling story to read, a harrowing one to be a part of, a one that has put you and your daughter together with a bond that could probably not have happened to that degree without that sort of situation, lifelong bond. And um, I'm gonna take you to you are the being the John Wayne, being the John Graham, helped save lots of people's lives, helped you keep your wherewithal and some of the feeling in some of your extremities for in a time when you probably shouldn't been able to have feel them anymore. And right there, as you didn't know if you were going to make it or not, you screamed out
Yeah.
and you got an answer.
Well, yes, but I'm going to slow you up just a second more because I had to do some recollecting just before I screamed out. And the recollection was, wait a minute, here I'm at the United Nations. I've helped end apartheid. I've turned my life around. It's been 10 years since Vietnam. And I'm now actively making peace and justice in the world, especially toward the third world. I'm doing a lot of good. I'm helping hundreds of thousands of lives in Africa and Asia. And I can't stay at the United Nations anymore because Ronald Reagan is now president. He thinks people like me are nuts. And so I got to get out of here. So I leave the Foreign Service, and then I'm so excited by my new ideals, for example, though that I don't even think about money. And then I realize I'm out of money, and that's why I got a job on the cruise ship. So that brings you up to the story you started. The cruise ships paid absurdly well, and I had to give a nothing lecture on foreign policy, and then the cruise ship catches fire, and in the beginning, we're put in a lifeboats in the middle of the night, and at dawn, helicopters arrive, and I watch one of them rescue my daughter and take her to a tanker that had answered the SOS, so that's great. But a storm's coming on, Typhoon Vernon, and after a time, the helicopters can't fly anymore because we're like in 30-foot seas. Anyone that's been in small boats knows a 30-foot sea is a monster sea. Winds gusting at 60 knots, and no helicopters. Our only hope is a Coast Guard cutter, frantically searching. And there's only 8 of us left now. Almost everybody else has been rescued, 500 and some people. But there's 8 of us left in lifeboat number 2. And at this point, I realize that I really am dying. But I don't know who to pray to. I'm not a religious person, really. And so I remember saying, I feel cheated. God damn it, I feel cheated. Here, I've done all this great stuff for the United Nations. I helped end apartheid. How bad is that, huh? I helped end apartheid, and now I'm being wiped out. I thought I was doing your work, God, or whatever. And now I'm being wiped out. It makes no damn sense. And so I got angrier and angrier and madder at the absolute. And the absolute, or whatever it was, a voice came back at me. And the other 7 guys, of course, didn't hear a damn thing. But boy, I sure heard something. And it basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here,
Mm-hmm.
it basically said, stop bullshitting me. Stop bullshitting yourself. You have developed, after Vietnam, a life full of ideals. And you've done some really good stuff at the United Nations. You have the courage and the skill and the resources to do good in the world. And you're starting to do it. And the minute things get a little tough, a Republican gets elected as president, you run out of money. These are little teeny things. They pull you off your ideals, and now you're lecturing on a cruise ship. You get out of this, you'll lecture on another cruise ship because it's a pretty soft deal, right? And you got a choice to make out here. Either you can keep lecturing on cruise ships and you'll die out here, 4 or 5 hours. You've got hypothermia. You guys, you 7 guys, you 8 guys are dying. You'll be dead by morning, or you'll be tossed out of this cockle shell of a boat. Or you can make the other decision. You can recommit to the ideals that you finally found at the United Nations. You can recommit, and your life will be different, and then we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
I was beaten. I had no reserves left and nothing. My famous ego was totally flat. And I remember turning into this wild storm, the rain pelting me like stones, and looking up and saying, okay, yes. And that instant, the cutter Boutwell comes crashing through the storm. I mean, as you might imagine, I tell the story a lot because I do a lot of public speaking. But nonetheless, it still marvels me that this story is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely true. It's just when I say yes that the cutter bow. Now, mind you, the visibility is down to about 100 yards, and we're in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska, 140 miles from the
Mm-hmm.
coast, and so finding us was a miracle. And the
Mm-hmm.
cutter bow will come straight for us. It would have cut us in two had the lookout not seen us. And obviously I'm rescued, and I never looked back from that. I
Mm-hmm.
kept that promise.
Mm. And for me, one of the many inspirations of your story and your life is how much how much opportunity in life there still is. You had lived so much, had so much adventure experience, and that was less than half a life, more than half a life ago.
Yes,
Yeah, this is before the Giraffe Project. This is before Anne. This is
yes,
before divorce, right? This
yes,
it's all getting close,
yes.
but this is before age 40, and here you are at 82 with a whole nother lifetime. And this is for everyone listening. There's so much opportunity to pivot. It literally is. It's never too late to pivot.
And it was, in fact, the final answer to that question that was first posed to me on the gravel bar on the McKinley River when I realized there had to be a meaning to my life. I
Hmm.
went to Vietnam thinking the meaning was adventure, and that was too shallow. And as I grew up, I began to realize that those people that thought they'd found meaning in, say, money and power, well, they weren't close either. Where meaning came from. And I got a lot of this from the people we've honored on the Giraffe Heroes Project, but mostly from my own life, was that real stable meaning, the kind that supports an entire life, comes from service, from giving back,
Hmm.
from using whatever skills and resources I had to help solve difficult public problems. And I began doing that the instant I got back to New York
Hmm.
from that ship disaster.
Hmm.
But again, I go back, and this was the final answer to a question asked like what 15 years before. Yes, there's meaning to my life. No, it didn't come from adventure. It came from service, and that's the rest
Hmm.
of my life is going to be about that. And I've never wavered from that. I've never
Hmm.
had any doubts. Everything I've done since then has been some kind of service. Not all of it has succeeded. I mean, I was very much involved in the Oslo Accords, for example, and helping achieve peace in the Middle East in the late 90s, and that didn't work. But a lot of stuff I did work, whether it was foreign affairs or solving environmental crises in the United States or working with Anne on the Giraffe Heroes Project.
Hmm.
My life has been extremely fulfilling because I found the meaning for my life, and I found it. I really found it, and there was
Hmm.
nothing else. The strategy for my life, one way of putting it, at least to sports fans, the strategy of my life was set. What wasn't set was the tactics. Every new adventure, every new challenge brings different tactics. So the
Hmm.
tactics change, the strategy hasn't.
Hmm. And I mean, we're talking decades of service and so much in, the book. This is actually at the towards the end of the end of your memoir is about the last, summarizing the last 40 plus years of your service and your love with Anne. And I found myself putting myself, where was I in life as you were progressing through yours? So I was born in 1970. I was actually born a day after you were born. And so on your marriage, on your 40, was it your 40th birthday? 40,
Yeah,
40th
40th. I was
birthday,
married on
19,
my 40th birthday. Yeah.
yeah, 1982. I'm like, okay, I'm 12. I'm in sixth or seventh grade. And again, I'm thinking of the life that you have lived since then, and then the process of being able to be grow into the person and man you want to be and be in love, which I want to talk about in a moment. I just want to say one more something that made me smile and filled my heart was Anne walked down the aisle to Annie's song, and my wife and I walked down our aisle to Annie's song.
Oh no.
Yes,
Oh,
and something we're not even talking about, but we listen to Gordon Lightfoot all the time, and I know that
oh.
is very meaningful to you. Tell me, tell us what what do you teach now is being a man?
Yeah. I only teach really one thing, and there are lots of bells and whistles attached to it. But the one thing I teach is there's nothing more important in your life, man or woman, than finding the true meaning for your life. That's it. And your whole life should be dedicated toward that. And it's a tough ask because there are all kinds of options for what might provide meaning to your life. I'm just telling you my story. I found it in service, and I suspect you might too. And then I've developed as you can guess, workshops and other books and all kinds of things that help people
Mhm.
along to find that meaning in their life. That describes service not as sackcloth and ashes or becoming a saint, but as the logical outcome of finding what's truly meaningful for your life. I mean, I
Mm.
talk to people. I says, "Look, there's a
Mhm.
reason why a bear has claws and an eagle has sharp eyes. They're meant for something. And
Mm.
if you have a strong artistic bent, well, it makes sense to look for your service as an artist. If, on the other hand, you're really good with figures and maybe a scientist or an engineer, or if
Mhm.
you're effervescent and really good with people, then I don't know, a corporate manager, a politician, whatever. But there are hints all around you, and you got to
Mhm.
be open to those hints. And I tell one of my favorite things, and people think I'm nuts. I says, look, try this just for one day. You're driving around. Every time you're stopped at a red light, think just for a second that is no accident you didn't hit the green. You're stuck there for 7, 8, maybe 38 seconds. There's a reason why. Stop drumming your fingers on the wheel and turn off the radio and just let your mind go blank until it turns green and see if there's a bit of an insight that comes in. And then maybe a block or two later, there's a billboard advertising peanut butter or motor cars, but there's some subtext on that billboard, some word that all of a sudden has a brand new meaning. And it makes sense with the thought that occurred to you at that red light. I mean, I just ask people to play as a
Mhm.
game because
Mhm.
finding meaning in one's life is no easy business, and it
Mhm.
can be extremely frightening, especially if you've got decades of other people telling you what the meaning of your life is and telling you what you should be doing with your life. Your parents, your coworkers, all of the pressures on you to become senior vice president and stuff. All of that stuff. There's so many other things to distract you. You have
Mm.
to get to a quiet place, and you don't have to even meditate. You just
Mhm.
turn off your mind at the red light, or maybe take a quiet walk around the block, or maybe if there's a local city park, just go down there for half an
Mhm.
hour. Just walk around,
Mhm.
look at the stars, something.
Yeah.
And because the messages are all out there. Now I'm really dense, I say to my audiences. I'm really dense. I'm like a Missouri mule. You have to hit me over the head with a 2x4 before I get it. But that's
Mhm.
not true for you. Probably isn't true for you. You can find these guidances in a lot of different places.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
so yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so I work with a lot of people, and I do a lot of mentoring of young men who are totally infused and headed right toward toxic masculinity. And I've learned long since that you don't preach to people to change their behavior. I've learned from Anne and the Giraffe Project, you change them through role modeling. So I take these
Mhm.
kids out, not so much now at 82, but I would take these these man boys out on tough rock climbs, for example. And I know their history, some of it's with drugs, some of it with bullying or whatever. And, when they're up 300 feet above the ground with just a rope tied to your waist, and you're ready to pee your pants, then you can have a real conversation. And so we get
Mhm.
back down to the campfire that night, and some of these kids, for the first time in their life, may open up, kind of like after those men shouted at me in California at that encounter group,
Mhm.
pissing your pants at 300 feet and
Mhm.
realizing that you weren't Superman up
Mhm.
there, staying alive just because of a rope. You begin to think a
Mm.
little differently, and you begin
Mm.
to listen to someone who may be 50 years older or 60 years older than you, but maybe he
Mm.
knows a little shit.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh, I got to say this because there may
Yeah.
not be another chance. I'm putting a lot of this into 3-minute TikToks for young men or
Look at you. TikToks. John
yeah,
Graham doing TikToks.
yeah.
Yeah.
And and you can dial it up on TikTok by looking for a badass granddad.
Oh, that's what I jumped in on with you and Phil before the show. I
Yeah,
jumped in right
badass
on
granddad.
Badass Granddad. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, guys. Everyone looking for Badass Granddad.
It's on
And
Instagram too, Instagram and TikTok. Yeah.
awesome. Awesome. Well, John, you walk the walk, you talk the talk, you model um honesty and transparency. And I know I can only imagine the process of writing, the therapeutic process of writing your memoir and the pain and the processing of this. And it's you never talk about yourself as a saint. You never put yourself in a positive light just to do so. You're very real. And it's those sorts of things that give people hope, right? That anyone, people for lots of different reasons do things in life which later in life we might not do or wish we didn't do. And we're always growing. Every day we're growing. Every moment we have this opportunity. And as you say, to go
Well,
within, to listen. And I wanted to say this other really important point, to have the courage to take action on what you're feeling, on what you're being led to, on something that seems crazy, that seems nuts, that everyone says, "What are you thinking?" To have this trust in yourself and this belief in a larger connection to all of us, to the universe, to wherever one gets their guidance, to whatever one believes. It's all real and it's all individualistic, and everyone is here for a reason.
if I could blush, I'd be blushing. Thank you.
Yeah.
I must
Mm,
also say, though, that a lot of me is very manipulative.
mm,
All the stories, all the stuff. I know these are good stories, and I know my redemption story is a good story. And that's not why I tell them. I tell them to gain credibility
mhm,
because I've long since realized that my role is not to preach to the converted. My role is to reach out to audiences that may be a long ways away from understanding what I'm
mm,
trying to get across about
mm,
meaning and service. And so, for example, if I'm invited to talk to 5,000 people at in a big convention hall, and I'm given 45 minutes, I'll spend 35 minutes telling my adventure stories. Each one, as you can gather, more wild ass than the one before. In the last 10 minutes, I'll pivot. I'll pivot and say, you can see that my life has changed. And I just want to tell you why. And then I talk about the transition in my own life and why. And then I go into the last 5 minutes like these are really everyman stories. They're everyman stories, every woman's stories. And a lot of stuff that's true for me is true for you too.
mhm.
So what is it that's meaningful to you as you drive home or you drive back to your hotel or you go out and have a drink with your friends in the office? Think about it. Think about it. What is it for you? Is it, are you really stuck in being senior vice president when really what you'd like to do is play saxophone in a jazz band? Well, think about that, damn it.
Mhm,
And just think about it. Think about it.
mhm,
The reason that I can do that is that if I'd started a 45-minute lecture by saying, oh, it's really important you find the meaning in your life and service is how I found it. Oh man,
mhm,
choke me with a spoon. I mean,
mhm.
I'd lose my audience right then and there.
Yeah,
People would respond to that.
yeah,
But when I
yeah.
tell war stories for 40 minutes, okay, everyone's on the edge of their seat, as I hope some people are from listening to this podcast. Everyone's on the edge of their seat and they're leaning forward to what I'm going to say next. So when I do a little pivot and I keep talking, they don't. They put down their phones or their tablets or they stop scribbling or gossiping or whatever. And they listen to that last 5 minutes. This is where I grab them. So, like I said, hey, I'm a little
Mhm,
manipulative, so
mhm.
don't go too
Yeah.
nicey on me.
Okay. I will try to temper myself, but I will end on this because this is what you realized about yourself, and that is you have your ways, yes, and you are a healer. You are a healer.
I guess I am.
Yes. Well, I we could talk a lot longer, and maybe we can talk again. There's so much wisdom that you bring through your experiences and your trials and tribulations, and you're processing, and you're becoming. And this has been really meaningful for me. I know it's going to be very meaningful for our listeners, and I am grateful for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Um,
Do you want to
and
tell everyone where they can find, besides Badass Grandpa? Tell everyone where they can find all your stuff.
Sure. Badass Granddad is the TikTok
Granddad.
Instagram.
Yeah, okay.
Badass Granddad. And my own personal website is my name, johngraham.org.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope this is the first, and it's great to be connected to you.
Well, stay in touch. Stay in touch, Dan, because, while we did the broad brush, the biographical thing, there's a lot of stuff to talk about in terms of making an impact on the world and how to do that. Perhaps a little bit less spiritual or philosophical, but nonetheless of interest.
I'm going to look forward to all of that. Yes. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening. Please send this recording, this show, to everyone that you know who will benefit. And I'm pretty much thinking anyone who's living and seeking, as we are all on the path to finding meaning as we go in and out of our days. Thank you for your 5-star reviews. They really do make a difference. And I will leave you with this thought. We've got this moment, this day, and this life. So let's make it a great one. This has been a Peters and Rossi production. Make It a Great One with Dr. Dan is produced by Laura Rossi. Our engineer is Phil Rossi. Theme music is Uplifting Folk by Awesome Music. Artwork by Kelly Dwyer. Follow us on social media at Dr. Dan Peters. For more information, visit drdanpeters.com.